I feel like I'm meeting like a secret apparition because I have been deeply inside of the work of this brilliant woman for the past week, and I've read 2 books. I want to first plug your first book and say everyone should buy that book. It's brilliant, and then your second book as well, also brilliant. And I want to just begin that the first book is this incredible foray into adoption and identity and race in America, and I just want to give you 100 points for that book. It was so exciting. So for this first, so the book, A Living, whoops, that's my notes.
You need your notes.
I'm gonna get my notes. It's all good, we're great. So this book, A Living Remedy, I want to ask you first, just, I can understand with the first book more that I almost felt like it was being pulled out of you. Mm-hmm. Like that story had to be told, and that it was, the telling was I don't know what it meant for you to tell it, but it felt like it had to come out. And this one feels different. I'm curious, what pushed you to write it, how you felt about writing it, why you wanted to write. And just for those of you that haven't read it, it's an incredible summary and memoir of family and race and class and illness and medical systems in America. And she does an incredible treatise of personal history. So what pushed you to write this book?
I mean, thank you so much, too, for your kind words and for being in conversation. And thank you all for being here. It really means a lot. It's hot out here, and you could be at the beach, so I especially appreciate it. But so real quickly, the first book, it's very hyper-focused on my adoption. So growing up as a transracial Korean-American adoptee, and my search for my birth family. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms, as it being pulled out of me. It did feel like a book I had to write almost because I did not see myself or anybody like me in the literary landscape. And at the time it came out, it was only 5 years ago. Since then, there have been more adoptee authored memoirs, which is really wonderful. We need more and more. But at the time, it was really one of the first mainstream ones. And it did well enough that I think it just meant a lot to me to be able to bring that story forward. Adoptees writing about adoption is actually not as common as it should be. And so if that book was about kind of making space for myself almost, and for others with similar stories, I mean, this book, A Living Remedy, it felt equally urgent, but it was coming from a very different place, obviously. My father actually passed away in 2018 before I went on tour for my first book, and my mother followed 2 years after that. And with my father's death in particular, I found that along with these waves of grief and anger and all the things that you feel when you've lost someone that you love, and you're trying to learn how to incorporate that loss into your life, who are you? It's almost like you're a different person trying to learn a new way of existing. And for me, mixed up with that was the fact that I knew, and my mother knew, we lost him so early. He was 67 and he died what my friend called a really common American death, which was from complications from diabetes, but because of years of lack of access to healthcare, because of financial precarity, and being denied assistance when he needed, being failed by these systems that aren't really set up to serve so many people. And I was thinking about, what was my responsibility to him? What had I failed to do? It was a lot of grappling with what my responsibility was, and also realizing I wasn't responsible for everything he was up against. These systems are set up so that we feel as though it's all on us. We love to talk about personal responsibility in this country, and of course we feel obligations to those we love, but the fact is when illness hits or crisis hits so many people, and my parents were among them, just as working class, non-college educated people who were getting older, had worked hard all their lives, but were getting sicker, had an expectation there would be help, there would be support, there would be resources for them that they weren't able to access. And so I couldn't really face my grief for my father without also facing the reality of these systems and their structural failings and American inequality. And that was where the initial seed for the book came from. But at the time, of course, I didn't know that my mother would get a terminal cancer diagnosis a year after my father had passed, and so then it became a very different sort of project. Honestly, I didn't know if I would ever be able to write it. When she got sick, I took a good year off writing and was really just kind of focused on her, and then the pandemic hit. So, there was also, in the same way I couldn't write about my father without writing about American inequality, I couldn't write about the process of caring for my mom and losing her in the spring of 2020, like in the midst of a pandemic, and like just what it meant to not have access to her at that time when we wanted it so badly. There was like a lot of different like threads wrapped up together, and it was sort of about, when I sat down to write again, finding like a new structure. And at the heart of the story, I realized the story I really wanted to tell was my relationship with my mother. And that's really at the foundation of this book. It begins and ends with her. And it was like that story that I wanted to tell and carry forward.
It was also beautiful because the first book, they're there, but they're framing the story of you searching for the other family. And so it's really nice that there's they go together beautifully. I wanted to ask you, well, in the book, when you talk about medical inequity, it's important how you lay it out. Like, you really show the ways in which like preemptive care isn't offered, and how like they were doing like emergency work on your father's dialysis rather than preemptive long-term care that the government should have offered him. I'm curious, like after you wrote this and after it came out, if a lot of other people came to you, and maybe if you have some stories to share that people offered about, because I felt this like weight for you reading it, that I was like, it's not you. This is the fact that he should have been given healthcare. Like, that's it. Like, he was really neglected by this country.
Right. And I think that what my parents had experienced and what I experienced growing up in their household was sort of this invisible, I hesitate to even call it poverty, but it was like an invisible need, because from the outside, and my parents thought of themselves, I thought of us as very middle class, but we didn't have health insurance most of my childhood, and they didn't have it after I left home. And there were long periods of unemployment and recession. I grew up in rural Oregon. There weren't a ton of opportunities there. And when you lost a job there, it was really hard to find another one. And so, I didn't really realize how dire the situation was, partly because they protected me so much. Of course, they didn't want me to worry. And I always had my sights set somewhere else. I think being the only Korean I knew in my town, like the only one, I really wanted to get out and see what else was in the world, and they wanted me to have that experience. So even though, like a lot of people, I think their choices were somewhat limited, they wanted me to have like boundless choice. But in terms of like the stories, it's similar to the first book in that when I wrote it, I started hearing from like so many adoptees, many adoptive parents saying like, this is the first time we've seen anything like our experience in literature. And to some degree, that's starting to happen a little bit with A Living Remedy because, again, it is such a common American story. Like what it means to, bless you. Sorry. No, please. What it means to get sick, to grow old. We have an elder care crisis in this country that no one really wants to face. We want to make it everyone's individual, personal, family responsibility instead of realizing it is a systemic issue, that we should be, you cannot face it alone at some point. And yet that's kind of what we're left to do. And like these systems leave so many people to kind of struggle on their own. And in times of crisis, you mentioned my father's dialysis. It was a crisis response, a last-ditch effort after his kidneys had really failed. And that's just such a common story. And one reason I wrote the book is because I know that many Americans are living with this reality, that this is how we're trying to take care of each other, we're trying to take care of our loved ones, and we're up against so much. And I think it's important to make that visible, to name what that is. And I have heard a lot of stories from people. It's interesting, like I heard, I did an interview with Oregon Public Broadcasting, so in my home state, and it was submitted as testimony for Oregon's Healthcare for All initiative, which was really meaningful. So I've actually heard from a lot of healthcare and health equity advocates. I've heard from healthcare workers, and we all know the healthcare crisis and also how the pandemic has laid a lot of those issues bare, and how we need to better support, better pay, take care of our healthcare workers as well. And I've heard stories as recently as yesterday, after yesterday's panel of people who lost loved ones, and it was either earlier than it should have been or even harder than it needed to be, because they didn't have the support and the resources that they needed.
Well, you do such a good job of just making it like a plain issue that's common and constant, because you show them working constantly, that they're always hardworking at their jobs, they're always they're inside of our economy, and yet they're not given these basic perks that every country should offer their citizens of ongoing care so that wouldn't have occurred. So great job on showing an issue like plain and simple to everybody. It's really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it was also interesting because my parents, like ideologically, we were pretty far apart, and it was so difficult for them to even accept they were at a point where, like, I remember it was difficult for them to like apply for unemployment. When my father had to apply for disability, it was like a 2-year battle. And like so many people, he was denied the first time. And it's very hard to get disability insurance in this country. You basically have to hire an attorney and fight and appeal. And it was hard enough for him to apply in the first place. Just like looking for what assistance was out there, realizing how much of it is, it's not just given to those who need it, right? Even then, there would still be like things to reform, but it's means tested, it's gate kept, it's available to some but not others. So much of it is about jumping through hoops and proving you're worthy and proving that you need it more than other people, constantly proving that like you deserve it, and it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
Of course it shouldn't, but that's part of it, is that it's just it's what's available is not as accessible as it should be. So while the book does kind of take on the healthcare system and its failings, I tried to be really honest about, like, there were many points at which the safety net really failed to catch my family, and it's, again, like such a common story.
Yes, and then, but you do it so well because built around that is the relationship. So you have the relationship with your father, the relationship with the house, the relationship with Oregon, the relationship with your husband and your mother, and it's really, you really sort of take us gently into this other world. And I wonder if you want to talk just like a little bit about the way in which the church played a nice role, and like the way that you were like held inside of that. I don't know what just happened, but it's fine. That the church, there's something incredible in this book about religion and its role, and you treat it very carefully, where it's like it's almost a science of what it's offering each family, and it really offered your parents. So I'm curious if you want to talk more about both during their sickness and also after, how the church held your family.
Sure, and to be clear, like the church, my parents were part of, I'm not a member of, they converted to Orthodox Christianity from the Catholicism I was raised in, so after I left home. And there's a chapter, it's actually one of my favorite chapters, and it involves like a vision my father had. But my parents were very devout, especially my mother, and their church community like really did. It took care of them. It was a very small, tight-knit community. I imagine you must have like many like that here on the island. But I had not seen a community in action in this way, like probably since I left my little hometown. When my father was sick, like they really drew together to support my family. They took up a collection. There was a contractor they knew through the parish who like made the house accessible for him, like ramps and installing handrails where they needed them. Someone made his casket, like, and wouldn't let my mother pay. Like it was just like really important to me to know they had that, because I was living across the country. I live in the East Coast. My parents were still in rural Oregon, and there were many times even before the pandemic when like that distance was so hard and I couldn't cross it as often as I wanted to. So knowing that they had like the love and support, and also they were really seen and nurtured by this community as like they were seen as who they really were and valued for that. It's not something that I've like personally experienced in that same way, but I was so grateful, that they had that. So yeah, and at the same time, I did try to be really respectful since it's not my community that I'm writing about. But it was I think important to include because it was so important to them and to who they were.
Well, that's like what the tenor of your book is. There's such like a lack of judgment that makes it really beautiful. And then church communities in that way are so vital. I really loved how you represented like the plain and simple way in which they supported. And there were rituals that I hadn't heard of. I forget what the name of it with the P is. That's the 40-day ritual. After it was like the priest came to the grave with everyone to release. Oh
yes, it's a Greek term, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
I know I had it in the book, but I can't find my note.
But it's it's a 40 days after death. They go to the grave and offer like prayers. It's another like shortened version of a funeral rite. And I wasn't there, and even if I had been, it's not the kind of thing I would have known to do.
Right.
But they went and did that for my.
I thought that was beautiful, and then also. I was just noticing like the recurring theme of how you were held, like even just with the practice of forgiveness. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about that beautiful part of the book, where as your mom is coming to the end, there's her community supported her, but it was a regular practice they did on Sundays, right? A forgiveness practice.
There's something called Forgiveness Sunday in the Orthodox Church, but it's a rite of forgiveness that you can do anytime. So I'm out there with my mother. It was actually, although we didn't know it, like our last visit. And a couple of her friends had come to help me talk with her about like end of life arrangements, which is such a hard thing to do, advance directives and all of that. And she really did not want to do it. It was one of those things that we sort of kept getting moved and moved. So a couple of her best friends came over to help. And before they left, like each of them took her hands and they said, like, forgive me my offenses, sister. And she said, like, I forgive you. And I asked her later what that was about. And she said, well, basically it's a way of having a clean slate every time you leave someone you care about in case you don't meet again. And so it's a rite that's often done with people who are sick or if you're going to be traveling and away from home a long time. She said it's like you don't want to forget to forgive. You always make forgiveness part of your farewell, which is something I will never forget. And because I felt and sometimes still feel like there's so much. Sometimes you lose someone and you do feel like there's still something unsaid, or you feel as though there's something you still need to apologize or seek forgiveness for. It was a really like meaningful way for me to think about our history as mother and daughter. You know, did anything stand between us that I wanted to try to like seek forgiveness for or forgive her for? I knew we had a farewell coming, and I did not want it to be without like that forgiveness, that grace as parent and child. And so, I don't know, that was just, again, it's not my faith tradition, but that ritual, that like witnessing that, it really helped me reframe part of my grief, like that anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
And think, well, there's so much here that she and I would never have chosen, but we do get to choose like how we say goodbye.
And so much intimacy that like makes it easier in some ways, I think. I loved that scene. I thought that was so beautiful and important. My brain just blinked. I'm curious too, if you want to talk just a little bit more about when the grief hit you. And I was thinking, there's like many, I could like define this book in different terms. I could say this is a story of like a daughter and her parents. And I could say this is a story about Oregon and like economics. Or I could say this is a story about the vital importance of preemptive care and grief leave. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit, because so there's, and I found the word, it's like pambika, I think, for the practice. But you really make it clear, very clear in this memoir, how intense it is when you lose a parent to go back to work. And so I have questions. I'll like put it on one and then you can answer. One is about grief leave, and two, how you held yourself writing this memoir, because you rewrote the deaths and you rewrote the pain. And so I'm curious how you, like what like personal practices you had to put in place to do that. So those are two different questions.
Oh, I
grief leave and personal practice.
I appreciate them both. I do write a little bit about bereavement leave, and I write a lot in this book about like what it means to grieve under capitalism, which is not something I'd thought about before I was going through it. The company I worked for a publisher at the time my father passed, and I was getting ready to publish a book. And there were so many things about publishing. You can't stop it once it's like the horse has left the barn. You just got to chase it. There were things I couldn't put off. There were things I just had to do. And because the book was coming out, at this interval. And my company didn't have a bereavement leave policy at that point. It was a small enough company that I think the understanding was like, ask for what you need. And there was nothing really codified. So I didn't know. I was like, a week? Is a week enough? I guess a week's probably enough. No, it's not. It's very much not. But any more than that, and it would have been unpaid. And I was financially supporting my mother at that point. And it was the same thing kind of when she got sick. I could have taken family leave. It would have been unpaid. And then no one would be paying her rent. So it was very much like having to choose. You can actually know what the healthier thing, or like, you can know that it would be better to take care of yourself and your grief and your emotions in this way. And again, this is part of how we live here, right? It's still kind of impossible to choose that.
Can I read a quote from your book real quick?
Oh, sure.
So she writes, just to remind ourselves of what it's like to grieve while working is insane, actually. And it's not good for the economy nor the individual. She says, for the rest of the day and most of the night, I cannot stop crying. I cry while I eat or drink. I cry in the shower and when I lie down to try to sleep. Even when I'm worn out, too hoarse for my sobs to make much of a sound, the tears keep coming silently drifting down my cheeks. And then later she says, for me, grief is like waking up every day in a different house. I feel as though I ought to know my way around by now. I've been grieving for my father for more than 2 years, but find that I'm continually losing my bearings, struggling to learn the layout anew. I will walk through a door in my mind that I didn't even notice the day before, trip over a memory I've relived 1,000 times, and it's as if I were seeing the space around me, breathing in this hushed loneliness for the first time. And I think that disorientation is like rarely spoken of, and you do kind of get reborn when a parent dies. I'm just gonna say that my book is about the loss of my father, and so I really appreciated hearing the resonance of this thing that we don't talk about in our culture and how hard it is to go to work and be in the same point of reference after your entire point of reference has been changed.
It's hard, and like that seems to be what we expect of people is there's like this period where people are very gentle with you and they're very solicitous, and that can also feel awkward, but like it's appreciated. There's a certain point at when you realize, of course, like it's not their loss. People have moved on. You're expected to kind of pick up and move on. And I think we don't do a great job at like talking honestly about what grief is like the lows. Also like the parts of it that are like just, there's no other term for it, like funny. Like sometimes the most disorienting parts of grief like can be funny. There were times, like I remember something my parents said, or my mother had a very like wonderful, dark, dry sense of humor. And we had put off like getting my father's gravestone for so long. And then at one point she told me, well, if you wait long enough, you can just get one stone for both of us. And it seems terrible like to laugh at, but I just do remember like this is so you. Like, of course you would say that. There are like things about the experience that can be funny too and remind us who these people are and how they face things, right? So I think all of that, it can sometimes feel like grief is this black box. Nobody wants to open it. You don't want to peek too closely inside. We are not a society, a culture that I think is comfortable with each other's pain or our own pain. Facing that is hard. We'll look for a million other ways. Sometimes it's work, sometimes it's anxiety. Sometimes it's some other way, like anything to avoid just feeling the actual pain itself. And so that was something else that I kind of learned, throughout the process. But in terms of writing the book, I mean, again, there were points at which I never thought I would write this at all. I was like, how can I write a book about like losing both of them and in a way that like will matter to other people, right? I didn't want it to feel like self-indulgent or like only trauma, and I hope it's not. I hope that like people see there's definitely moments of joy and there's moments of levity and community and like people just doing their best to take care of each other. And I think too, like in certain places, of course, it does like take a very frank look at what it means to like grow sick or grow old or die in this country, what it's like for networks, for communities, for loved ones as well. In terms of taking care of myself, I really had to develop like a whole new relationship to my work and my writing to write this book. With my first book, and I didn't write my first book that long ago, it was like 2016, 2017. I've always been a very nose to the grindstone writer. My other job, I'm a freelancer, I'm a journalist. I'm used to meeting deadlines. I'm used to working through weekends, working late nights, whatever it takes. I'll get like revisions at 11 p.m. I'll fact check on a Saturday. Like that's just what's required with the job sometimes. But writing a book is different. It's a longer project. And the emotional terrain of this book, combined with writing it during a pandemic, while my kids are home doing Zoom school. I'm trying to help my younger daughter get through the Zoom school day. And like while I'm trying to work full time, I just had to show myself a lot more grace and a lot more patience. What I realized later is, I have to treat myself like a human being and not a robot, because in fact, I'm not a machine. And if I had tried to just kind of force my way through, I don't think this would have been the book it needed to be. I was able to kind of work on it in fits and starts. I really was in a meditative state writing a lot of it. I think that's why it's like more lyrical than my first book. Is it has a different feel. Certainly like it sinks deeper, I think, emotionally. And that's because like a lot of my process was like taking a long walk through the woods and just being with myself and thinking about the book and about my parents and doing that active memory work. Because writing this also meant spending time with them and like remembering who they were, their gestures, the way they talked, like things we fought about, things we loved about each other. And there was no looking away from that pain. Whereas sometimes when you're grieving, you can try to protect yourself. Like you can't look too closely all the time. It's very intense. I'm sure you've experienced the same thing. Writing a book, you can't spare yourself. You know, you have to like remember, you're summoning up who these people were and are to you, and you can't look away from it. And so I was glad I gave myself like the time and the grace and the patience I needed to do that, because it was not like a something that I could spare myself, you know, if I wanted to grieve, but also if I wanted to write, you know, this story.
Yeah. When you talk about giving yourself grace, will you give me like 2 examples?
Oh yeah. So I mean, one really is like, instead of just sitting with my butt in the chair, like trying to like make a sentence work that wasn't working, I would just leave. Like I would not write. And I would actually get really good at tricking my brain into thinking, we're not writing, like we're not working at all. We're going to go for a walk. You'll do laundry or, you know, whatever. Call a friend. I did a lot of that. And I wasn't even calling to talk about the book. I was just calling to chat. And they were ways of like, I think any breakthroughs I had, for like any narrative issues I managed to resolve, it was when I stepped away and I started to notice, oh, that's like an important thing to pay attention to. I always thought it was just like about having your butt in the chair and writing until it's done. And sometimes that's the case. I do want to stress, I think, especially when I write journalism, that's how it often works. But a project like this, it's so intimate, it's much longer. It's just such a sustained narrative, and it was so emotionally like deep. I needed sometimes to just step away. Yeah. So not writing was the first thing. And then like what did I do? I think I moved my deadline twice. First book, I did not. I mean, I remember finishing that actually like the week after my father passed, because I didn't know you could miss a deadline. People do it all the time, by the way. Asking for extensions is so common, but I did not know that. I was in like debut author mode, especially like as a marginalized person in publishing, thinking like, I just have to be the easiest, best person to work with. And so, but the second time I was like, yeah, that I'm gonna need like another 6 months. Oh, it turns out I'm actually gonna need another year. And thankfully my editor was really gracious and understanding. She said, you know, memoir is gonna take the time it takes. She's like, don't get me wrong, we want the book, but like take the time you need. She also knew I would have tinkered with it for like 5 more years if she didn't eventually like tear it from my hands. But so I was an editor for many years, and I still, my editor brain is always trying to sabotage my writing. But yeah, just asking for more time and like realizing, like building rest into the process, and like just recognizing when I couldn't write, and then not forcing it. I don't mean it sounds so basic, but it took me
not basic.
It took me till my late 30s to learn this. So I sort of wish I'd known earlier.
I once found Norman Mailer's like list of what his writing day looked like, and I mean, not that he's our hero, but he would go, but it was like sleep 1 hour, like walk 1 hour, and that was part of the practice.
Wasn't stare out the window on the list for a while?
It's like but it's part of writing.
A lot of that.
And I think also there's a difference between being a journalist and a memoirist where you become the subject.
Right.
And so you have to treat yourself with love, or the subject sort of.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing about myself, and then I'll move on back. When I was writing mine, to make myself write, I would order ice cream. Yeah. And I would say, okay, because I wrote during the pandemic, and I'd be like, okay, in 2 hours, ice cream will come. Now write. And I do that to myself all the time. I'm like, you can have a muffin when you're done, or something like that. Well, death writing also is different, because death writing, I mean, I want to get a little bit more into how, because you went so deep, like you went to the death scene, and you went to the funeral, and to the dressing of the person, and like you went to a lot of pieces that are so hard to navigate. So I feel like treats and baths or whatever, I'm curious, like, it's so important to hold yourself through that difficult work. Yeah, I mean, I like to, I think I have a really intimate writing style. Like, it's one of, I don't know if you'd call it a strength or just like what I do, but I try to like bring readers in. Why it's not about telling you intimate details of my life, actually. Like, my goal is always to help you think about your losses, your loved ones, your experiences. It's like in the specificity, it's in the details, I think, when we read other stories that we're able to like
it can become a place where we meet ourselves as well, right? I think when the genre is working, like that's what it does for people. It gives you like a chance to reconsider your own experiences, and in the case of our books, I think your own losses. So I also think like during the pandemic, again, this is not a pandemic book, but like and I was really adamant about not writing a pandemic book, but I think it's true that we've obviously all experienced so much individual and collective grief over the past few years, and it can feel as though, and then you throw in like generational grief, and you throw in just like the general loss and disappointment that we all lived through when we couldn't see people we wanted to see, when important events were canceled. There's a lot of like collective grief that it can feel like it's unacknowledged. We've had like maybe one national moment where we like thought about our pandemic dead, and it's kind of shameful that that's all we've had. I think there's a real tendency to want to look away sometimes from grief, from loss, from trauma, but I don't think we can or we should forget these things. I don't think we can or should look away from what we've all individually and collectively experienced.
Agreed.
So I mean, especially like writing this book during a pandemic. The pandemic itself really only comes into a couple chapters, but I mean, I was very consciously thinking about what everyone was going through. And like my friends, even friends who'd never experienced like the loss of a loved one, like they didn't have to dig deep to understand some of what I was feeling, because we were all living through this moment of like collective shock and loss. Some of it exacerbated by the society that we live in. That's
why it's so important that you wrote it, though, too, because then they can see so much of what we don't speak about in our culture is like alive right now, and you give voice to that. One of the things I just want to come back to that you do and weave through this book that's so like beautiful is she does this. I'm telling them. She does this cool thing where she shows these lists. And so there's like the list of what her mother sent her in college. And then there's the list of what she sent her mom when she was sick. And so she closes the book with the list. And I wanted to just read this list, and then I have like my last question, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. Things my mother left me, she says. This lovely woman to my left. 3 wooden jewelry boxes, mostly filled with earrings she had stopped wearing after her ear piercings closed. Pictures of every house she lived in. A raku vase and bowl made by a friend. A pink needlepoint heart I made for her in grade school. Every card, note, and drawing my daughters ever sent to her. Her high school yearbook, her black and white senior portrait wallet-sized, her replacement wedding band bought after she donated my parents' original wedding bands to the church. 6 small colored glass vases collected by my grandmother. My father's favorite Cleveland Brown sweatshirt and his bucket hat. Her impeccable taste in musicals and mystery novels. Her stubbornness, her anxiety, a habit of silently reciting Hail Marys when I'm worried and can't fall asleep, a belief that my children will be okay, an expansive definition of the word okay, a model of forgiveness, the hope that I can be half the parent she was, her icon of the angel at the tomb, why do you seek the living among the dead, her love of the ocean. And one of the things that I found really beautiful in this book that I kind of answered some of my questions from your first book was this idea of inheritance. And what I realized that you sort of tell a very clear story in this book about your belonging in this family in a different way than the other book understands. And that you actually inherit this family's pain, and you inherit this family's beauty, and that you are like you had a line, and I had marked all these pages, but it's too hard to find them on stage. But you say something really beautiful about like your ancestry and your chosen blood, and that this concept of adoption is also addressed really beautifully in this book. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, about this concept of inheritance. Like that at the very end, I kept writing the word over and over again. What did this woman inherit?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I didn't write the two books that far apart again, but I was like a completely different person. You become a different person when you lose someone, and I lost both of them in quick succession. Like if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, I've always felt a little out of place in my adoptive family. Like no question of like our love and devotion, my parents' rock solid acceptance of me, like their faith in me, their trust. Those things never wavered, but there was always like maybe partly because of where I grew up and when, there was always this feeling like I don't quite fit, or like there's more out there. I really wanted to know, like, quote, like where I come from. It's part of what led me to search for my birth family, and seek those connections. But like through the process of like caring for my parents through their illnesses as best I could, and like honestly through the process of witnessing like their deaths, I guess that's true. I really, I don't know. I mean, I was like, oh my God, you were right. Like, truly the important thing in the end was our love for each other. Like, there were all these other things I thought were so important too, and they are. Like, heritage is important, culture is important, and knowing my origins is something I'll always be grateful for. But they were right about that part, about the love being what mattered most in the end. Like, that's what we're left with. And that was like the greatest part of their inheritance to me, was just, again, this love and this faith that I would, even when we disagreed, and we disagreed all the time, like they thought I would do the best thing for me. They couldn't imagine a life or a world where I wasn't happy. Like they would never imagine that. It was always interesting to me because my mother was such an anxious person. She did not worry about like my happiness, and she did not worry about my daughters. It was just like, of course you're going to be fine. You have to be fine. And she knew better than most that, like, you know, again, that expansive definition of the word okay doesn't always mean what we think it or hope it will mean. But yeah, so I hope so much of like what they left me, their legacy, is that love and that trust and that faith. And I guess that is like so much the part that I hope to like hold on to and carry forward, not just with my own family, but like in all of my relationships, in my writing. I want to bring that type of love and faith in people, not the kind that is like sort of blind to injustice, or the kind that smooths over, you know, real issues that need to be talked about, but at the heart, like that's what they were. There was love and there was trust. So that, I think of that as like kind of my biggest inheritance from them.
You said my ancestors by love and choice, if not by blood. That's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. I absolutely like still like feel and am conscious of like their presence, and I haven't tried to define that in terms of what it means for me, but it feels very real.
I love that.
They still feel very real.
I think we're being...
Your conversation was so great, but unfortunately we're out of time.
Oh.
So that's but
I thought that was the question.
yeah, that's good. So to allow time for questions.
Oh no.
So, but
if you have questions, you should come up to the signing and ask her one-on-one.
I would love to. I'm sorry that we went through that. I love audience questions.
I think you shouldn't be sorry. You were fabulous.
I keep saying, people, they apologize, and I say, it was great. It was great.
It usually
really
means you have
great.
something good to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all again so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. It was great. You did such a good job.